a decorated combat engineer returned home from war only to discover his own brother had stolen everything he owned, leaving him homeless and broken. But what he found inside an abandoned Soviet aircraft carrier would silence everyone who ever betrayed him and change his life forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The rain fell in sheets across the tarmac at Dulles International Airport, streaking the windows of the terminal like tears on glass. Inside, families clutched welcome home signs and yellow ribbons, their faces bright with anticipation. Children bounced on their toes, craning their necks toward the arrival gate. Wives dabbed at their eyes, mothers whispered prayers of gratitude. Marcus Cole watched them all from behind the glass partition, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his army dress uniform pressed but hanging loose on a frame that had lost 23 pounds in the past year. He was 38 years old, a staff sergeant with the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and he had just completed his fourth and final deployment to Afghanistan. No one was waiting for him. He stood there for a long moment, watching a young private get swallowed up by his family's embrace, watching a captain lift his daughter onto his shoulders, watching an elderly couple weep as their grandson walked toward them in his desert fatigues. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, something he'd learned to bury deep during 14 years of service. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder and walked toward the exit alone. The limp was more pronounced now than it had been 6 months ago. The doctors at Landstuhl had done what they could, but the IED that detonated under his vehicle in Helmand Province had left its mark. 3 vertebrae compressed, nerve damage running down his left leg, partial hearing loss in his right ear that turned crowded rooms into walls of static. And the invisible wounds, the ones that woke him at 0300 with his heart racing and his sheets soaked through, those didn't show up on any X-ray. Marcus had given everything to his country, 14 years of his life, 4 deployments, countless nights sleeping in dust and danger while mortars whistled overhead. He'd watched friends die in his arms. He'd held pressure on wounds that couldn't be stopped. He'd written letters home for boys too young to know how to say goodbye. And now here he was, limping through an airport terminal, watching families reunite while he walked toward an uncertain future. But Marcus wasn't bitter. Not yet. Because waiting for him back in Virginia, or so he believed, was everything that mattered. His mother's house, the small craftsman bungalow in Portsmouth where he'd grown up, where the porch swing still creaked in the summer breeze, where her garden still bloomed with roses she'd planted before he was born. She'd passed away 3 years ago, breast cancer that took her faster than anyone expected, and Marcus had inherited the house. He'd left it in his brother's care. David was 5 years older, the responsible one, the one who'd stayed stateside and built a life while Marcus chased combat zones. David had a wife named Karen, a decent job at an insurance company, and 2 kids Marcus barely knew because he'd missed so many Christmases. But David was family. David was blood. And when Marcus deployed for his final tour, David had promised to watch over the house, to keep the lawn mowed and the pipes from freezing and the property taxes paid. Marcus had signed a power of attorney before he left, just in case. Just so David could handle emergencies while Marcus was overseas, unreachable, focused on keeping his men alive. He trusted his brother completely. The cab ride from the airport took 47 minutes. Marcus watched the familiar landscape slide past, the strip malls and fast food joints giving way to older neighborhoods, tree-lined streets, houses with American flags hanging from porches. His heart rate increased as they turned onto Maple Street. He could already see it in his mind, the white siding, the blue shutters, the rose bushes pressing against the fence. But when the cab pulled to a stop, Marcus didn't move. The house was gone, not destroyed, not burned down, just different. The white siding had been replaced with grey vinyl. The blue shutters were now black. His mother's rose bushes had been torn out and replaced with ornamental grasses. A for sale sign stood in the front yard, the word sold stamped across it in aggressive red letters. "This the right address, buddy?" the cab driver asked. Marcus couldn't answer. He just stared. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. His bad leg nearly buckled beneath him. He walked toward the house like a man approaching a grave, stopping at the edge of the property line. Through the front window, he could see strangers moving inside. A woman arranging furniture, a man carrying boxes. They lived here now, in his mother's house. In his house. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. He grabbed the fence post to steady himself, his vision swimming, his ears filling with a high-pitched whine that had nothing to do with the IED. "Can I help you?" a voice called. He turned to see an elderly woman on the neighboring porch, the same Mrs. Patterson who'd brought casseroles after his mother's funeral, who'd promised to keep an eye on things. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus managed. "The house. What happened to the house?" Her face crumpled with something between pity and confusion. "Oh, Marcus, honey, you didn't know." "Know what?" "Your brother sold it. Must have been, goodness, 8 months ago now. Said you'd agreed to it. Said you were starting fresh when you got back." Marcus's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the curb, his duffel bag tumbling into the gutter. Mrs. Patterson hurried over, her hands fluttering uselessly. "I thought you knew," she kept saying. "I thought you knew." But he didn't know. He didn't know anything except that everything he'd fought for, everything he'd survived for, had been stolen while he was bleeding in a hospital bed on the other side of the world. Marcus called David 17 times that night. Each call went to voicemail. He texted, he emailed, he even tried Karen's number. Nothing. Silence. A wall of digital rejection that felt more violent than any ambush he'd survived. He spent the night in a motel off the highway, the kind of place that charged by the hour and didn't ask questions. The mattress sagged in the middle. The television got 3 channels. The walls were thin enough to hear the couple next door arguing about money. Marcus didn't sleep. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone, waiting for an explanation that never came. The next morning, he drove to David's house. It was a nice place, nicer than Marcus remembered. New siding, new landscaping, a boat parked in the driveway that definitely hadn't been there 2 years ago. Marcus pulled his rental car to the curb and sat there for a long moment, trying to steady his breathing. Then he walked to the front door and knocked. Karen answered. She was dressed for work, her makeup perfect, her expression cold as stone. "Marcus," she said, not stepping aside to let him in. "Where's David?" "He's not here." "I need to talk to him. The house." "I know about the house." Karen crossed her arms. "David handled everything while you were gone. The taxes were behind. There were repairs needed. It made more sense to sell." "Sell?" Marcus's voice cracked. "That was my mother's house. That was my house. He had no right. He had power of attorney. He had every right." Karen's eyes were flat, emotionless. "You were gone, Marcus, for years. You can't just disappear and expect everything to stay frozen in time." "I was serving my country. I was in a hospital for 4 months. I almost died. And we're sorry about that, truly. But the decision was made. The money is gone." Marcus felt his chest constrict. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" Karen sighed like he was a particularly slow child. "There were debts, Marcus, expenses. David's business hasn't been doing well. We had to make adjustments. You stole from me. You stole my inheritance, my mother's house. We did what we had to do." Karen's voice hardened. "And if you want my advice, you'll accept it and move on. There's nothing left for you here." "Nothing left?" Marcus stepped forward, his hands shaking. "I have nothing. No house, no savings. You drained my accounts too, didn't you? The power of attorney, you used it to take everything." Karen didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. "I want to talk to David, right now." "He doesn't want to see you." He's my brother. Karen laughed, a cold, brittle sound. Is he? Because the way he tells it, you stopped being family years ago. You chose the army over us. You chose strangers over blood. Well, now you're on your own, just like you wanted. She stepped back and closed the door in his face. Marcus stood on the porch for a long time, his mind reeling, his body frozen. The door didn't open again. No one came to explain, to apologize, to make it right. He was alone, more alone than he'd ever been on any battlefield. Eventually, he walked back to his rental car and sat behind the wheel. The anger came later. It started as a spark in his chest and grew into a fire that threatened to consume everything. He wanted to break down David's door. He wanted to scream until someone listened. He wanted to hire lawyers and file charges and make them pay for what they'd done. But anger requires fuel, and Marcus had none left. His body was broken. His mind was fractured. His spirit, the one that had carried him through 14 years of war, had finally cracked. He spent the next few weeks trying to fight back legally. He found a lawyer who agreed to take his case on contingency, a young woman fresh out of law school with idealistic eyes. But the news she delivered crushed what little hope remained. The power of attorney was broad, she explained, spreading documents across her cluttered desk. Too broad. Your brother had authority to make financial decisions on your behalf, including the sale of property. The house sale was legal, even if it was unethical. What about my savings? He cleaned out my bank accounts. Also covered under the power of attorney, you authorized him to manage your finances. I didn't authorize him to steal everything I own. She sighed, rubbing her temples. I understand, but proving fraud is difficult. Your brother was careful. Everything was documented, signed, notarized, and the statute of limitations on some of these transactions is what? Running out or already past. She looked at him with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry, Marcus, truly. What they did was wrong, but legally our options are limited. Marcus sat in silence for a long moment. Then he stood, shook her hand, and walked out of her office without another word. He sold his rental car a week later, then his watch. Then the medals and ribbons he'd earned over 14 years of service. Each sale carved away another piece of his identity until there was almost nothing left. He was a ghost, a shadow, a man who'd given everything for his country and been rewarded with betrayal. The disability checks from the VA covered basic expenses barely. Marcus found work at a decommissioned naval shipyard in Norfolk, doing security patrols for minimum wage. The job was simple. Walk the perimeter, check the locks, report anything suspicious. The shipyard was a graveyard of maritime history, rusted hulks waiting for salvage, forgotten vessels from wars long ended. Marcus fit right in. He lived in a 1974 Airstream trailer he'd bought for $800 from a man who'd given up on travel. The previous owner had died in it, the seller admitted, but Marcus didn't care. Death didn't frighten him anymore. Sometimes in his darkest moments, it felt like the only friend he had left. The trailer sat at the edge of the shipyard property, technically illegal, but tolerated by management because Marcus was the only guard willing to work the overnight shift. The view was nothing special, just rusted cranes and empty dry docks and the grey expanse of the Elizabeth River. But at night, when the world fell silent and the stars appeared through gaps in the clouds, Marcus could almost pretend he was somewhere else. Somewhere that still believed in things like hope and justice and family. The dog appeared 3 weeks after Marcus moved in. He was a mutt, maybe some German shepherd mixed with something larger, his fur matted and his ribs showing through his skin. He wandered into Marcus's campsite one evening and refused to leave, just sat there watching with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. Marcus tried to ignore him at first. He had enough trouble feeding himself without adding a dependent. But the dog was patient, persistent, showing up every evening at the same time, sitting at the same distance, asking for nothing but presence. Finally, Marcus broke down. He shared half his dinner, a can of beans and some stale bread, and the dog ate like he'd never seen food before. From that night on, they were inseparable. Marcus named him Sergeant. It felt right. The nightmares continued. Marcus would wake gasping, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, his heart pounding with the memory of explosions and screams. Sergeant would press against him in those moments, warm and solid, grounding him to the present. The dog never complained about the midnight terrors. He just stayed close and waited for Marcus to remember how to breathe. They developed routines, morning walks along the waterfront, evening patrols of the shipyard, shared meals that improved slightly as Marcus learned to stretch his budget. Sergeant's ribs filled out. Marcus's nightmares became slightly less frequent. It wasn't healing, not exactly, but it was survival. One night in late November, Marcus was walking his usual patrol route when he noticed something different. The shipyard was divided into sections, some active and some abandoned, and the far eastern corner had been cordoned off for as long as anyone could remember. Management never explained why. Workers never asked. It was just one of those places that existed in every industrial site, forgotten and ignored. But tonight, moonlight reflected off something massive in that restricted area, something that shouldn't be there. Marcus hesitated. His patrol route didn't include the eastern section. His job description specifically forbade entering restricted zones. He could lose his position, his trailer space, what little stability he'd managed to rebuild. But 14 years of military service had honed instincts that civilian life couldn't dull. Something was wrong. Or maybe something was waiting. He called Sergeant to heel and change direction. The restricted section was protected by a rusted chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that had mostly collapsed. Marcus found a gap large enough to squeeze through, his bad leg protesting as he bent and twisted. Sergeant followed without hesitation. What he saw on the other side stopped him cold. An aircraft carrier. Not American. The design was wrong, the proportions unfamiliar, the angles aggressive in ways that spoke of different engineering philosophies. Marcus had studied enough military hardware to recognize Soviet construction when he saw it. This was a Kuznetsov-class carrier, one of the few the Russians had ever built, and it was sitting here in an American shipyard like a forgotten monument to the Cold War. The vessel was massive, easily 1,000 feet long, its hull rising from the water like a rusted cliff face. The flight deck was empty and corroded, the superstructure tilted slightly to port, and every surface was covered with the patina of decades of neglect. Seabirds nested in the radar arrays. Rust bled down the sides like ancient wounds. Marcus approached slowly, his flashlight cutting weak paths through the darkness. He'd heard rumors about this ship, fragments of conversation among the older workers, something about a shell company purchasing it for scrap in the 90s, something about bankruptcy and legal disputes, something about it being too expensive to break down and too politically sensitive to move. It had been here for nearly 20 years, waiting for someone to decide its fate. Marcus circled the base of the vessel, his boots crunching on gravel and debris. Up close, the scale was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't just a ship. It was a floating city, a self-contained world that had once housed thousands of sailors and pilots and officers. Now it housed only silence. He found a ladder on the port side, rusted but still attached to the hull. The sensible part of his brain screamed warnings. Unstable structure, no backup, no permission, career suicide. But another part, the part that had survived 4 combat tours and the betrayal of his own blood, that part was curious. Marcus tested the first rung. It held. He began to climb. The ascent took longer than expected. His leg cramped twice. His hands grew slick with rust and moisture, and twice he had to stop just to catch his breath. Sergeant whined from below, unable to follow, and Marcus called down reassurances he didn't fully believe. But he kept climbing. The flight deck stretched before him like an empty parking lot, 200 feet wide and long enough to lose sight of the edges in the darkness. Marcus walked slowly, his flashlight sweeping left and right, illuminating patches of corroded metal and abandoned equipment. Jet blast deflectors stood like skeletal fingers. Arresting cables lay coiled like dead snakes. Everything was frozen in time, preserved by neglect rather than intention. Marcus found a hatch leading below decks and descended into the ship's interior. The darkness here was total, absolute, swallowing his flashlight beam like hungry shadows. The air was thick with the smell of rust and old oil and something else, something organic that made his stomach turn. He moved through corridors that seemed designed by someone who hated natural light. Pipes ran along every surface. Cyrillic stencils marked doors and junctions. Propaganda posters, faded but still visible, encouraged workers to exceed production quotas and resist Western imperialism. The crew quarters were the hardest to see. Bunks still had blankets on them, neatly folded in some cases, thrown aside in others. Personal effects littered the floors, photographs, letters, a child's toy that made Marcus's throat tighten. These men had lived here, worked here, built relationships and told jokes and dreamed of home. And then something had happened, something that made them leave everything behind. Marcus checked his watch. 0200. He'd been inside for over an hour, and he'd barely scratched the surface. The ship was enormous, its interior a labyrinth of compartments and passages that could take weeks to explore fully. He was about to turn back when his flashlight caught something unusual, a door different from the others. Heavier, reinforced with Cyrillic text that Marcus couldn't fully translate but understood instinctively. This wasn't a crew quarter or a storage room. This was something important. He tried the handle. Locked, obviously, but the mechanism was old and Marcus had spent years learning how to breach secured structures. He pulled out his multi-tool and went to work on the hinges instead, the skills coming back to him like muscle memory. 20 minutes later, the door swung open. What he found inside was a captain's cabin, larger and more luxurious than the Spartan crew quarters. A desk dominated one wall, covered with papers and binders. A bookshelf held volumes in Russian and English, and on the desk, weighted down by a glass paperweight, was a leather-bound journal. Marcus sat in the captain's chair, something that felt almost sacrilegious, and opened the journal to the final entry. The handwriting was cramped but careful, Russian that Marcus couldn't read. But tucked into the back of the journal was a folded letter, typed on onion skin paper with a translation attached. Someone had wanted this to be understood. To whoever finds this vessel, my name is Captain Anatoly Petrov. If you are reading this, then the Federation has fallen, or I have, or perhaps both. The truths recorded here have waited long enough. In the final months of the Soviet Union, certain officers were ordered to evacuate state assets before they could fall into the hands of corrupt officials and Western opportunists. Gold reserves. Platinum. Artwork seized during the Great Patriotic War. Gems and currencies and documents too sensitive to leave behind. I was tasked with hiding these assets aboard my vessel until a legitimate government could claim them. That government never came. What remains is secured in the forward cargo hold, Section 7. The seals are intact. The manifest is attached. May God forgive us for what we hoarded while our nation starved. If you have found this, then Providence has chosen you. Use what you find wisely. Use it for good. I was not brave enough to return these treasures to the light, but perhaps you will be. Captain Anatoly Petrov, December 1991. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling more with each pass. Gold reserves, platinum, artwork, gems, hidden in the forward cargo hold of a forgotten Soviet aircraft carrier, waiting for someone to find them. He looked up from the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. Somewhere deep in the belly of this rusted giant, a fortune was waiting. A fortune that had been hidden for over 30 years while empires crumbled and the world moved on. Marcus thought about everything he'd lost: his mother's house, his savings, his brother's love, his faith in family. He thought about the trailer where he slept alone with his nightmares, about the disability checks that barely covered food and gas, about the life he'd sacrificed everything to build, only to watch it stolen by the people who should have protected it. And now this. He stood slowly, the captain's journal clutched in his hands. The ship groaned around him, metal settling in the cold night air, like it was waking up after decades of sleep. Somewhere below, in Section 7, a door was waiting. Marcus had spent 14 years learning how to breach fortified positions. He'd trained to read structural weaknesses, to bypass security systems, to enter places that didn't want to be entered. For the first time since he'd come home, those skills felt relevant again. He made his way back to the flight deck, the journal tucked inside his jacket. Sargent was still waiting at the base of the ladder, tail wagging despite the hours of cold and darkness. Marcus climbed down carefully, favoring his bad leg, and knelt to scratch behind the dog's ears. "We found something, boy," he whispered. "Something big." Sargent licked his face, oblivious to the magnitude of what his human had discovered. Marcus looked back at the carrier, its silhouette massive against the pre-dawn sky. The ship had been sitting here for nearly 20 years, ignored and forgotten, its secrets sealed behind rust and time. No one knew what was inside. No one had cared enough to look, until now. He walked back to his trailer slowly, his mind racing faster than his broken body could move. The letter's words echoed in his head. Use what you find wisely. Use it for good. But first, he had to find it. And finding it would require preparation, equipment, knowledge that went beyond his military training. He couldn't just storm into the cargo hold and expect the treasures to present themselves. The ship was a maze, potentially unstable, definitely dangerous. And if anyone else learned what was hidden inside, Marcus would have competition. Or worse, he needed to be smart. He needed to be careful. He needed to remember every lesson 14 years of service had taught him about patience, planning, and precision. Inside the trailer, Marcus spread the captain's journal on his small table and began to study. His hands were steady now, his mind focused. The grief and anger that had consumed him for months began to transform into something else: purpose. He had been a ghost since coming home, a man without direction, without hope, without any reason to keep fighting. But now there was something worth fighting for. Not revenge, though part of him still wanted to see David's face when he learned his betrayed brother had found fortune. Not greed, though the thought of wealth after years of poverty made his pulse quicken. This was about something bigger. Marcus looked at Sargent, curled up on the trailer's narrow bed, already snoring softly. He looked at the faded photographs pinned to the wall above the stove, his mother in her garden, his unit in Afghanistan, himself as a young man before war had carved away his innocence. He thought about the homeless veterans he'd seen on street corners, the ones who'd given everything and received nothing. He thought about the suicides that claimed more soldiers than combat ever did. He thought about the broken system that chewed up warriors and spit them out without support or dignity. Use it for good. Maybe that's what Captain Petrov had meant. Maybe that's why Marcus, of all people, had found the journal. Not because he deserved wealth, but because he understood what it meant to be forgotten. Dawn was breaking over the Elizabeth River, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Marcus stood at the trailer door, watching light reclaim the shipyard from darkness. The aircraft carrier was visible in the distance, its rusted bulk somehow less menacing in the morning glow. He had work to do, research to conduct, plans to make. But for the first time in months, Marcus Cole felt something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous probably, potentially life-changing in ways he couldn't predict. But it was a road, which was more than he'd had yesterday. More than he'd had since walking through that airport alone, since seeing strangers in his mother's house, since hearing his brother's wife tell him there was nothing left. There was something left. Deep in the belly of a forgotten Soviet warship, a fortune was waiting, and Marcus Cole, broken veteran, betrayed brother, survivor against all odds, was going to find it. He closed the trailer door, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and began to plan. The week that followed was the most focused Marcus had been since leaving the army. Every morning he woke before dawn, walked Sargent along the waterfront, then drove to the Norfolk Public Library as soon as the doors opened. He told himself it was research. In truth, it was obsession. He started with Soviet naval architecture. The library's collection was limited, but the librarians were helpful, ordering interlibrary loans and pointing him toward academic databases he could access on the public computers. Marcus learned about the Kuznetsov-class carriers, their design philosophy, their construction timeline, their eventual fate after the Soviet collapse. Most had been scrapped or sold. A few remained in Russian service, barely operational. But several had simply vanished into the chaos of the 90s, purchased by shell companies, towed to foreign ports, and forgotten. The carrier in the shipyard matched the profile perfectly. Marcus dug deeper. He found articles about Soviet gold reserves, about the frantic evacuation of state assets during the final months of 1991. He read about trains loaded with treasure disappearing into the Siberian wilderness, about ships sailing for destinations they never reached, about underground vaults sealed and abandoned as the government collapsed around them. The scale of what was lost or hidden was staggering. Billions of dollars in gold alone, not to mention artwork, gems, currencies, and classified documents. Most of it had never been recovered. Historians assumed it had been stolen by oligarchs or melted down and sold on black markets. But Captain Petrov's letter suggested another possibility. Some of it had been hidden by loyalists who believed the chaos was temporary, who expected a legitimate government to eventually reclaim what had been protected. They had been wrong. The Soviet Union was gone forever, and the treasures remained sealed, waiting. Marcus also studied the shipyard's history. The carrier had arrived in 1997, purchased by a company called Maritime Salvage International. The plan had been to strip the vessel for scrap metal and sell the components. But Maritime Salvage International had gone bankrupt within 2 years, its assets frozen in legal disputes that dragged on for over a decade. By the time the courts sorted everything out, no one wanted the carrier anymore. The scrap market had collapsed. The cost of environmental remediation exceeded any potential profit. The ship was simply abandoned, left to rust while lawyers argued about liability. No one had ever properly inventoried the interior. On the 5th day, Marcus shifted his research to practical matters. He made lists of equipment he would need: cutting tools, flashlights, rope, first aid supplies. He studied blueprints of similar vessels, memorizing the general layout of cargo holds and access corridors. He practiced techniques for breaching sealed compartments, drawing on training he'd received years ago in Army engineering courses. The challenge was money. His security job paid barely enough to cover food and gas. The equipment he needed would cost hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. Marcus sold his last remaining possession of value, his father's pocket watch, a silver piece that had been passed down through 3 generations. The pawn shop gave him $240 for it. Marcus didn't allow himself to feel the loss. He just took the cash and headed to the hardware store. He bought a battery-powered angle grinder, extra cutting discs, heavy-duty flashlights with spare batteries, 50 feet of climbing rope, work gloves, a first aid kit, and a crowbar. The total came to $217. He had $23 left, enough for dog food and canned soup for 2 weeks. After that, he'd figure something out. On the 7th night, Marcus returned to the carrier. The moon was new, the darkness absolute. He'd chosen this night deliberately, minimizing the chance that anyone would notice his approach. Sargent stayed in the trailer this time, whining at the door as Marcus left, but eventually settling down. Marcus wore dark clothing and carried his equipment in a military-style rucksack. He moved through the shipyard with the silent efficiency of a man who'd spent years operating in hostile territory. Every shadow was cover. Every sound was a potential threat. The restricted section was exactly as he'd left it. No signs of other visitors. No indication that anyone had noticed his previous intrusion. The carrier loomed in the darkness, a massive shadow against the slightly lighter sky. Marcus climbed the ladder again, his arms burning with the weight of his pack. The ascent was harder this time, but he'd trained for worse. He reached the flight deck breathing heavily, sweat cooling on his skin despite the December chill. Inside the ship, the darkness was total. Marcus moved by flashlight and memory, retracing his steps from the previous visit. The corridors felt different at night, more oppressive, the silence heavier. Every creak of settling metal made him pause and listen. He found the captain's cabin easily and retrieved the journal he'd left hidden behind a loose panel. Then he continued deeper, following the route he'd planned from blueprints and intuition. The forward section of the ship was a maze within a maze. Corridors branched and dead-ended. Staircases led to decks that had partially collapsed. Flooding had claimed some compartments entirely, black water visible through gaps in the flooring. Marcus moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. His bad leg ached constantly, a reminder of the price he'd already paid. But he kept going. After an hour, he found what he was looking for. A stairwell, exactly where the blueprint suggested, leading down to the lower cargo holds. But the entrance had been sealed. Not just locked or blocked, but welded shut with heavy steel plates that bore the marks of cutting torches. Someone had wanted this passage permanently closed. Marcus studied the welds carefully. They were professional work, clean and strong, designed to resist casual attempts at entry. But they were also over 30 years old, and decades of saltwater air had done what time always does. He unpacked his angle grinder and went to work. The sparks lit up the darkness like fireworks, casting dancing shadows on the corridor walls. The noise was tremendous, echoing through the empty ship like thunder. Marcus worked quickly, knowing that every minute increased the risk of discovery. The first plate fell away after 20 minutes. The second took another 15. Behind them, the stairwell descended into absolute blackness. Marcus shone his flashlight down the steps. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, swallowed by shadows that seemed to have weight and substance. The air that rose from below was cold, dry, and ancient. He descended. The stairs went down 3 levels, deeper than he'd expected. At the bottom, another corridor stretched into the darkness, lined with doors that stood open like hungry mouths. Marcus checked each one as he passed. Most were storage compartments, empty or filled with rusted equipment. One had clearly been a medical bay, examination tables still bolted to the floor. Another held rows of bunks. The mattresses rotted to nothing, the frames corroded beyond recognition. But at the end of the corridor, one door was different. It was massive, reinforced steel, covered with Cyrillic text that Marcus now recognized from his research. Warnings about authorized personnel only, references to state security protocols. And at the center, a symbol he'd seen in books, the hammer and sickle surrounded by wheat, the seal of the Soviet Union. This was it, Section 7. Marcus approached slowly, his heart pounding. The door had a complex locking mechanism, wheels and levers that looked like something from a submarine. He tried the main wheel. It didn't budge. He examined the hinges. They were massive, industrial grade, designed to resist exactly the kind of forced entry he'd used on the stairwell. The angle grinder wouldn't work here, not without hours of cutting and multiple blade changes. But Marcus noticed something else. The frame around the door wasn't original. It had been installed after the ship was built, retrofitted into a space that hadn't been designed for such heavy security. And the retrofit work, while professional, had required cutting into the original bulkhead. Those cuts had weakened the surrounding structure. Marcus shifted his attention from the door to the wall beside it. The metal here was thinner, patched with welds that had corroded over the decades. He pressed his hand against one section and felt it flex slightly. He smiled grimly and picked up his crowbar. 3 hours later, Marcus broke through. The hole was barely large enough to squeeze through, the edges sharp enough to tear his jacket and slice his forearm. But he was through, inside Section 7, standing in darkness so complete that his flashlight seemed to barely function. Then his eyes adjusted, and he stopped breathing. The hold was enormous, stretching the full width of the ship, and every inch of it was filled. Wooden crates stacked to the ceiling, marked with Cyrillic stencils and stamped with official seals. Metal containers the size of refrigerators, locked and chained. Wrapped bundles that could have been anything from weapons to artwork. And in the center of the space, arranged in neat rows, smaller boxes that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. Marcus approached the nearest crate and examined it closely. The wood was dry and brittle, preserved by the sealed environment but weakened by age. The markings indicated origin. Soviet State Treasury, 1989. He found a loose board and pried it away. Inside, packed in straw and protective cloth, were gold bars, each one stamped with the hammer and sickle, each one weighing what looked like a standard kilogram. Marcus lifted one carefully. The weight was unmistakable, that particular heaviness that only precious metal possesses. He counted the bars in the crate. 40. He estimated the number of similar crates in the hold. At least 200. 8,000 kilograms of gold. At current prices, that alone was worth over $400 million. And that was just the gold. Marcus moved through the hold in a daze, opening crates and containers, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Platinum ingots in another section, their silvery surface untarnished by time. Stacks of currency, mostly Deutsche Marks and Swiss francs, bundled and sealed. Jewelry that looked like it belonged in a museum. Necklaces, rings, crowns, pieces that sparkled with diamonds and rubies and emeralds. One section held nothing but artwork, paintings in protective tubes, sculptures wrapped in cloth, icons whose gold leaf reflected his flashlight like captured fire. Marcus recognized some of the styles from his mother's art books, old masters, Russian romantics, pieces that should have been hanging in the Hermitage or the Tretyakov Gallery. And there was more, so much more. Briefcases filled with documents, their pages yellow but still legible. Containers marked with chemical symbols he didn't recognize. Sealed crates that he didn't dare open. Their warning labels suggesting contents too dangerous to disturb. Captain Petrov's letter had mentioned assets worth protecting. Marcus had imagined millions. What he was looking at was worth hundreds of millions, possibly more. He sat down heavily on a crate, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The flashlight trembled in his hand. His breath came in short gasps that echoed in the cavernous space. This wasn't a treasure. It was the entire economic heart of a collapsed superpower, sealed away while empires crumbled and the world moved on. And now it belonged to him. The thought was absurd, impossible. He was a broken veteran living in a rusted trailer, surviving on disability checks and canned food. He couldn't own this. He couldn't even comprehend this. But there it was, stacked around him in the darkness, waiting for someone to carry it back into the light. Marcus thought about his brother, about the house that had been stolen, the savings that had vanished, the betrayal that had left him with nothing. What would David think if he could see this? What would Karen say if she knew that the man she'd dismissed as worthless was sitting in a room filled with more wealth than their family would see in 1,000 generations? The anger returned, hot and familiar, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like fuel rather than fire. Marcus wasn't going to waste this discovery on revenge. He wasn't going to become the kind of person who destroyed others for money. He thought about Captain Petrov's letter. Use it for good. Maybe that was why he'd been led here. Maybe all the pain, all the loss, all the betrayal had been preparation for this moment. He'd lost everything so he could understand what it meant to have nothing. And now, with everything suddenly possible, he could choose to be better than the people who had hurt him. Marcus stood slowly, his bad leg protesting. He had a lot of work to do. What happens next will turn this discovery into something far greater than wealth, reveal dangers that Marcus never anticipated, and remind us why sometimes the most broken among us are the ones chosen to heal others. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The next month was the most carefully planned of Marcus's life. He couldn't move the treasure alone. The logistics were impossible. Thousands of pounds of gold and precious materials secured deep in a ship that no one was supposed to enter. He needed help, but help meant trust, and trust was something Marcus had learned to ration carefully. He started with research. Maritime salvage law was complicated, a tangle of international treaties and domestic regulations that varied by jurisdiction. But the basic principle was clear. Abandoned property in navigable waters could be claimed by anyone who discovered and salvaged it. The aircraft carrier had been abandoned. The company that owned it no longer existed. The legal disputes over its fate had been resolved years ago, with a court order declaring the vessel a navigational hazard subject to disposal. No one had disposed of it. No one had claimed it. For nearly 2 decades, it had simply sat there, forgotten. Marcus had a legitimate claim, but legitimacy required proof. It required documentation, witnesses, legal representation. It required bringing other people into a secret he'd been guarding alone. He thought about who he could trust. The list was painfully short. Most of his army friends had scattered after discharge, lost to distance and time. His family had proven themselves unworthy of trust. The few acquaintances he'd made at the shipyard were strangers, people he knew by first name only. Then he remembered Colonel Patricia Hayes. She'd been his commanding officer during his second deployment, a career soldier with silver eagles on her collar and a reputation for taking care of her people. Marcus had served under her for 18 months, the most stable period of his military career. When he'd been injured, she'd personally called the hospital to check on his condition. When he'd been discharged, she'd written a letter of recommendation that probably helped him get the security job. If anyone would listen, if anyone could help navigate the legal and bureaucratic maze that stood between Marcus and legitimate ownership, it was Colonel Hayes. He found her through the VA website, listed as a liaison officer working with Veterans Affairs in Washington. Her official bio mentioned advocacy work, policy development, and something called the Wounded Warrior Transition Program. Marcus stared at her contact information for 3 days before finally sending an email. Colonel Hayes, I hope this message finds you well. You probably don't remember me. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, Afghanistan, 2012 to 2014. I served under your command during the Kandahar rotation. I need your help with something unusual. I've discovered property that I believe I have a legal claim to, but the situation is complicated. I wouldn't reach out if it wasn't important. If you have time to talk, I would be grateful. Respectfully, Marcus Cole. The response came 2 days later. Sergeant Cole, of course I remember you. You're the engineer who rebuilt that village well under fire while the rest of us were trying to evacuate. I recommended you for a commendation that never came through because the paperwork got lost in a command transition. Still bitter about that. I'm intrigued by your message. Unusual discoveries aren't typically my department, but you've earned enough credit with me that I'm willing to listen. Call my office number when you're ready to talk. I'll make time. P. Hayes. Marcus made the call that afternoon. Explaining the situation was harder than he'd expected. He started with the shipyard, the security job, the restricted section no one ever entered. He described the carrier, the captain's cabin, the journal and letter he'd found. And then, carefully, he described what he'd discovered in Section 7. Colonel Hayes listened without interrupting. When he finished, the line was silent for so long that Marcus thought the connection had dropped. "Sergeant," she finally said, "are you telling me you found a Soviet treasure ship in a Virginia naval yard?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you're just calling me about it now?" "I didn't know who else to trust." Another long pause. "You realize how this sounds?" "I do. That's why I took photographs." He'd gone back twice more, documenting everything he could reach without disturbing the cargo. "I can send them to you. I can take you there, if you want to see it yourself. Photographs first, then we'll talk about field trips." Marcus emailed the images that night. By the next morning, Colonel Hayes had called 3 times and left urgent voicemails. When he finally reached her, her voice was different, sharper, more focused. "Those photos are real," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Marcus, do you understand what you found?" "I think so. At least I'm starting to." "Those gold bars alone, if they're authentic, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. The artwork, if it includes what I think it might include based on your descriptions, could double or triple that. This isn't a treasure hunt. This is an international incident waiting to happen." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What do I do?" "First, you do nothing. You don't go back there. You don't tell anyone else. You sit tight until I can get some people in place." She paused. "Second, you need a lawyer, not a regular lawyer, someone who specializes in maritime salvage and international property disputes. I know a few. Let me make some calls." "I can't afford a lawyer. I can barely afford to eat." "I'm aware of your situation. The lawyers I'm thinking of work on contingency for cases like this. If your claim is valid, they get paid when you get paid. If it's not valid, nobody owes anything." Marcus exhaled slowly. "You believe me?" "I believe those photographs, and I believe you're not creative enough to fabricate a story this complicated." There was warmth in her voice, something almost like maternal affection. "I also believe you deserve better than what life's given you so far. Let me help." The next 2 weeks were a blur of phone calls, video conferences, and documents. Colonel Hayes connected Marcus with a maritime lawyer named Raymond Shue, a sharp-featured man in his 50s who spoke in precise sentences and never seemed surprised by anything. Raymond reviewed Marcus's photographs, researched the carrier's legal status, and declared the case promising but complicated. "The ship is clearly abandoned," Raymond explained during one of their calls. "Maritime Salvage International forfeited all claims when they dissolved. The court order from 2011 essentially declared the vessel res derelicta, abandoned property. Your discovery gives you a legitimate basis for a salvage claim. So it's mine." "Not automatically. You'll need to file formal documentation, establish chain of possession, and deal with some significant complications." Raymond paused. "The contents of that hold aren't just valuable, they're historically significant. The Russian Federation may attempt to claim them as state property. Various museums and governments may argue for repatriation, and then there's the question of provenance." "Provenance?" "Origin. Some of that artwork was almost certainly looted during World War II. Previous owners or their descendants may have legitimate claims. This isn't going to be a simple process, Marcus. It could take years." Marcus absorbed this. "But I do have a claim." "You have a strong claim. The question is how much of that treasure you'll be able to keep once all the other claims are sorted out." Raymond's voice softened slightly. "That said, even a fraction of what you've described would be life-changing money. We're not talking about enough to buy a nice car. We're talking about enough to buy a small country." The days grew shorter as winter settled over Norfolk. Marcus continued his security patrols, maintaining the appearance of normality, while Raymond filed paperwork and Colonel Hayes coordinated with federal contacts. The carrier sat in its forgotten corner of the shipyard, patient and silent, waiting. But Marcus wasn't the only one paying attention. He first noticed the footprints on a Thursday morning. Fresh boot prints in the frost near the restricted sections fence leading toward the carrier and then back again. Someone had been there recently, walking the same path Marcus had walked. He reported it to Raymond, who immediately escalated to Colonel Hayes. That evening, Marcus received instructions to stay away from the carrier entirely until further notice. 3 days later, he learned why. A salvage company called Atlantic Maritime Solutions had filed competing claims to the carrier and its contents. Their paperwork, submitted just hours after Raymond's initial filing, asserted that they had been conducting authorized surveys of the vessel for months and had already documented significant assets aboard. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach when he read their filing. They knew. Someone knew about the treasure, and they were trying to steal it from him. Raymond wasn't concerned. Their claim is fraudulent, he said flatly. They can't prove prior access or discovery. Their documentation is generic, probably based on public records about Soviet carriers rather than actual inspection of this vessel. But they filed a claim. Anyone can file a claim. Proving it is another matter. The photographs you took, the journal from the captain's cabin, the detailed descriptions of the hold's contents, that's evidence they can't fabricate. Raymond paused. However, this does mean we need to accelerate our timeline. We need to get federal inspectors on that ship before Atlantic Maritime has a chance to contaminate the scene. Colonel Hayes made the arrangements. Within a week, a team from the Coast Guard arrived at the shipyard, accompanied by representatives from the FBI's Art Crime Division and a maritime archaeologist from the Smithsonian. Marcus led them to the carrier personally, retracing his steps through the corridors and passages that had become as familiar as the layout of his trailer. When they opened the sealed hold and saw what waited inside, no one spoke for a very long time. The official inventory took 3 weeks. Armed guards were posted at the carrier around the clock. Media inquiries were deflected with vague statements about ongoing investigations. Marcus was asked to provide detailed accounts of his discovery, answering the same questions dozens of times for different officials with different badges. Through it all, he remained calm, patient, focused on the goal he'd set for himself the night he first saw the gold. Use it for good. The final valuation came on a cold February morning. Marcus sat in Raymond's office, Colonel Hayes on speakerphone from Washington, as the lawyer reviewed the official assessment. The gold and platinum alone are valued at $187 million, Raymond read. The artwork, including 12 pieces tentatively identified as works seized during World War II, is estimated at $52 million, though that number could change significantly depending on provenance research. The gems, jewelry, and other precious materials add another $21 million. He looked up at Marcus. Total estimated value of the discovery, $260 million. The room was silent. Marcus, Colonel Hayes said softly, do you understand what this means? Marcus thought about his mother's house, sold by a brother who had promised to protect it. He thought about the trailer where he'd spent months fighting nightmares alone. He thought about Sargent, waiting faithfully at home, and about all the other veterans he'd seen sleeping under bridges and begging at intersections. Yes, Ma'am, he said quietly. I think I do. The legal battles would continue for years. Claims and counterclaims would be filed. Governments would negotiate. Museums would argue. Atlantic Maritime Solutions would eventually be exposed as a front for organized crime, their executives indicted on fraud charges that had nothing to do with Marcus. But on that February morning, sitting in a lawyer's office with his commanding officer on the phone, Marcus Cole made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to keep the money for himself. Not all of it, anyway. enough to live comfortably, to pay off debts, to never worry about rent or food again. But the rest, the vast majority of whatever he eventually received, would go towards something bigger. A foundation. For veterans. For the forgotten soldiers who had given everything and received nothing in return. For men and women who'd been betrayed by the systems they'd trusted, just like he had been. Captain Petrov had asked whoever found the treasure to use it for good. Marcus intended to honor that request. The weeks following the official valuation were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and sleepless nights. Marcus found himself thrust into a world he'd never anticipated, one filled with lawyers in expensive suits, government officials with carefully neutral expressions, and journalists who circled like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Raymond Shu became his constant companion through it all, guiding him through depositions and hearings with the patience of a man who had navigated far more complicated waters. Colonel Hayes flew down from Washington 3 times, each visit bringing new complications and new strategies for addressing them. The Russian Federation filed their expected claim within days of the valuation becoming public. Their argument was straightforward. The treasure had been Soviet state property illegally removed during the chaos of 1991 and therefore remained the rightful possession of the successor state. They demanded immediate repatriation of all assets. Raymond dismissed the claim with characteristic precision. Their argument fails on multiple grounds, he explained during one of their strategy sessions. First, the assets were moved by authorized Soviet military personnel acting under orders. Second, the Russian Federation explicitly disclaimed interest in this vessel during the 2011 court proceedings. Third, and most importantly, they can't prove the treasure ever legally belonged to the Soviet state in the first place. What do you mean? Marcus asked. Much of this material was seized during World War II. Some of it belonged to private citizens who were killed or displaced. Some came from occupied territories. Some may have been legitimate state reserves, but separating what's what will take years of research. Raymond smiled thinly. The Russian claim is political theater. They know they won't win, but they need to be seen trying. More troubling was the claim from Atlantic Maritime Solutions. Despite the fraud investigation that had exposed their criminal connections, they continued to press their case through shell companies and proxy lawyers. Their tactics shifted from legal arguments to something more concerning: harassment. It started with phone calls, blocked numbers at odd hours, heavy breathing, then disconnection. Then came the letters, unsigned, threatening, promising consequences if Marcus didn't walk away from what wasn't his. His trailer was vandalized twice, windows smashed and tires slashed. Sergeant started growling at shadows, sensing threats that Marcus couldn't see. Colonel Hayes arranged for security. 2 former military police officers, both veterans themselves, began rotating shifts outside Marcus's trailer. The shipyard hired additional guards for the carrier. Federal marshals were assigned to protect the treasure itself, which had been partially removed to secure storage facilities while the legal process continued. But Marcus knew the danger wasn't over. Atlantic Maritime Solutions was connected to people who didn't accept defeat gracefully. People who had built fortunes on taking what didn't belong to them. People who saw $260 million as worth any risk. He started carrying his service pistol again, a decision he'd avoided since discharge. The weight of it against his hip felt familiar and strange at the same time, a reminder of the life he'd left behind and the threats that had followed him home. One night in late March, Marcus was walking Sergeant along the waterfront when he noticed a vehicle he didn't recognize. A black SUV with tinted windows parked in the shadows near the shipyard entrance. It had been there when he started his walk. It was still there 30 minutes later. Marcus changed direction, moving toward the security checkpoint instead of his trailer. The SUV's engine started as he walked, headlights remaining off, the vehicle crawling forward to match his pace. He broke into a run. His bad leg screamed in protest, but adrenaline overrode the pain. Sergeant bounded beside him, sensing the urgency, his ears flat against his head. The security checkpoint was 200 yards away, then 100, then 50. The SUV accelerated. Marcus dove behind a concrete barrier just as the vehicle roared past, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. It didn't stop, didn't circle back, just continued through the shipyard's main gate and disappeared into the night. He lay there for a long moment, breathing hard, his heart threatening to crack his ribs. Sergeant licked his face anxiously, whining in confusion. "I'm okay, boy," Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure that was true. The incident was reported to federal authorities. Surveillance footage from the shipyard cameras captured the SUV's license plate, which traced to a rental company in Richmond. The renter had used a stolen identity. The trail went cold, but Marcus understood the message. Someone was watching, someone was waiting, and someone was willing to kill to get what he'd found. Raymond arranged a meeting the next morning. Colonel Hayes joined by secure video link, her face tight with concern. "This changes things," she said without preamble. "You're not just a claimant anymore, Marcus. You're a target. I figured that out when the car tried to run me down. The question is what we do about it." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her image flickering slightly on the screen. "My contacts at Justice are willing to offer witness protection, new identity, relocation, the whole package. You walk away from the claim, the treasure gets distributed according to whatever the courts decide, and you disappear." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Walk away?" "It's an option, not a recommendation, just an option." Raymond spoke carefully. "There's another approach. We accelerate the legal process, push for immediate partial distribution of undisputed assets, get enough of the claims settled that Atlantic Maritime and whoever's behind them lose their leverage." "How long would that take?" "Months at minimum, possibly longer if the Russians keep filing motions." Marcus looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly from the previous night's adrenaline. He thought about the trailer, the dog, the security guards who now shadowed his every move. He thought about the treasure sitting in federal storage, millions of dollars in gold and gems and artwork that criminals wanted badly enough to kill for. He thought about running, disappearing into some witness protection program in Iowa or Montana, spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering when the past would catch up. And he thought about the letter, Captain Petrov's final words, written in the darkness of a dying empire. Use it for good. "No," Marcus said quietly. Colonel Hayes raised an eyebrow. "No to which option?" "Both. I'm not running, and I'm not waiting months for the courts to sort this out." He looked up, meeting her eyes through the screen. "There has to be another way." Raymond and Colonel Hayes exchanged glances. Something passed between them, an unspoken conversation that Marcus couldn't quite read. "There might be," Colonel Hayes said slowly, "but it's risky, and it requires trusting people you've never met." "I trusted you," Marcus replied. "That worked out okay." She almost smiled. "Fair point." The plan that emerged over the next week was more complex than anything Marcus had imagined. Colonel Hayes had connections throughout the federal government, relationships built over decades of service. She called in favors, made promises, leveraged her reputation in ways that would have made a politician envious. The result was a task force, not a formal one, nothing that would show up in official documents or budget reports. Just a collection of people who believed in doing the right thing and had the skills to make it happen. There was Raymond, of course, handling the legal architecture. There was a forensic accountant named Diana, who could trace money through offshore accounts like a bloodhound following a scent. There was a cybersecurity specialist named Thomas, who had worked for the NSA before deciding that government service wasn't for him. And there was a maritime salvage expert named Captain Elena Vasquez, who had spent 20 years recovering treasures from shipwrecks around the world. They met in a secure conference room at a hotel in Arlington, chosen because it had no connection to any of them. Marcus felt out of place among the professionals, his worn jeans and faded jacket contrasting sharply with their crisp attire. But Colonel Hayes made introductions like he belonged there, and gradually the others began to treat him as an equal. "Here's what we know," Diana began, spreading documents across the table. "Atlantic Maritime Solutions is a front. Their real funding comes from a network of shell companies registered in Cyprus, which trace back to a consortium based in Moscow." "Russian organized crime?" Raymond asked. "Adjacent to it? Some of the same players, but not officially connected. These are businessmen who got rich during the privatization chaos of the 90s and have been expanding ever since." Diana tapped a photograph in the center of the table. "This is the man we believe is running the operation, Viktor Kozlov. On paper, he's a legitimate shipping magnate with interests in 3 continents. In reality, he's suspected of smuggling, money laundering, and at least 4 murders that couldn't be proven." Marcus studied the photograph. Kozlov looked like a corporate executive, silver hair, perfectly groomed, expensive suit, confident smile. Nothing about him suggested the violence Diana was describing. "Why does he want the treasure?" Marcus asked. "He's already rich." "Because this isn't about money," Thomas answered, pulling up something on his laptop. "It's about legitimacy. Kozlov's been trying to buy his way into respectable society for years. Museums, galleries, political donations. But he keeps getting blocked by people who know his real history. This treasure, especially the artwork, would be his ticket to the legitimate world. Collectors would line up to buy from him. Museums would accept his donations. Governments would overlook his past in exchange for cultural treasures. And he's willing to kill for that? He's already killed for less." The room fell silent. Marcus looked around at the faces of people who had chosen to involve themselves in his problem, who had risked their reputations and possibly their safety to help a stranger. "Why are you all here?" he asked quietly. "This isn't your fight," Colonel Hayes answered. "Because some fights matter more than others, and because you're not fighting for yourself anymore, Marcus. The foundation you want to build, the veterans you want to help, that's bigger than treasure or titles or personal gain. That's worth protecting." Captain Vasquez nodded. "I've spent my career recovering things that were lost. This is the first time I've had a chance to help someone build something new from what was found. That's worth my time." One by one, the others offered similar sentiments. They believed in the cause, they believed in Marcus, and they were willing to see it through. The next phase of the plan required Marcus to return to the carrier one final time. The federal marshals had removed most of the treasure, but certain items remained too large or too fragile to transport without specialized equipment. These pieces, mainly the artwork, were still secured in Section 7, protected by armed guards and surveillance systems that Thomas had helped design. But there was something else in that hold, something Marcus had noticed during his initial exploration but hadn't fully investigated. A series of sealed containers in the far corner, marked with symbols he hadn't recognized. During the official inventory, they'd been catalogued as miscellaneous materials, contents unknown, and set aside for later examination. Marcus had a feeling they were important. He made the trip on a cold April night, accompanied by Captain Vasquez and 2 of the federal marshals who had become familiar faces over the past months. The carrier looked different now, spotlights illuminating its hull, temporary structures erected on the flight deck, the whole operation looking more like an archaeological dig than a salvage claim. They descended into the ship's interior, following paths that had been reinforced and lit since Marcus's first solo exploration. Section 7 was exactly as he remembered, except emptier. Most of the crates were gone, replaced by numbered markers indicating what had been removed and where it had been taken. But the containers in the corner remained. Captain Vasquez approached them with professional curiosity, running her fingers along the seals. "These are different from the others," she observed. "The construction is more sophisticated. See these gaskets? They're designed to maintain a controlled atmosphere inside. Whatever's in here, someone went to considerable trouble to preserve it." "Can we open them?" She considered the question. "Technically, yes. But we should document everything first. If these contain what I think they might contain, we'll want a complete record." The marshals set up cameras while Vasquez prepared her equipment. Marcus stood back, watching, his heart rate increasing with each passing minute. He'd learned to trust his instincts over 14 years of military service. Those instincts were screaming that something important was about to be revealed. The first container opened with a hiss of escaping gas. Vasquez shone a light inside and went very still. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you need to see this." He stepped forward and looked. Inside, packed in custom foam cradles, were documents. Not just any documents, but leather-bound volumes with gold embossing, thick portfolios sealed with wax, and what appeared to be original manuscripts protected by glass covers. "What is this?" Marcus breathed. Vasquez was already examining one of the volumes, her movements careful and reverent. "If I'm not mistaken, this is the complete financial record of the Soviet Union's secret reserve system. Transaction logs, account numbers, asset locations, everything they kept hidden from their own government." She looked up, her eyes wide. "This is worth more than the gold, Marcus. This is historical documentation that scholars have been searching for since 1991. They opened the second container. More documents, these ones clearly older. Manuscripts in languages Marcus couldn't identify. Illuminated texts that looked medieval. A collection of letters bearing seals from royal houses across Europe. The third container held something different. Modern briefcases, dozens of them, each one locked with combination mechanisms that had long since seized up with age. Vasquez carefully forced one open and found it filled with bearer bonds, stock certificates, and banking documents from institutions around the world. "This is access," she whispered. "Not just treasure, but access. Whoever controlled these documents could potentially claim accounts that have been sitting dormant for 30 years. We're talking about billions of dollars in frozen assets." Marcus sat down heavily on an empty crate. His mind was reeling. He'd thought the gold was the discovery. He'd thought $260 million was the extent of what he'd found. But this was something else entirely. "Who knows about this?" he asked. "Just us, and whoever originally sealed these containers." Vasquez looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Marcus, this changes everything. The people after you, they're not just after the treasure anymore. If they know about these documents, or even suspect they exist, they'll never stop. This is the kind of information that governments go to war over. Then we need to get it out of here, all of it, tonight." Vasquez nodded slowly. "Agreed. But we need to be smart about it. If we move this material to federal storage, it becomes part of the official record. Governments will claim it. Lawyers will fight over it for decades. Some of it might never see the light of day." "What's the alternative?" She smiled grimly. "We make copies. Everything that can be photographed or scanned, we document before it leaves this hold. Then we put the originals in secure storage and wait for the legal process to sort itself out. And the copies? Those go somewhere safe, somewhere that no government can reach, somewhere that historians can access them when the time is right." She paused. "I know people, academics, archivists, institutions that exist outside the normal channels. They've been preserving sensitive materials for decades. They can protect this." Marcus considered her words. It was a risk. Bypassing official channels, creating duplicate records, trusting strangers with information that could shake governments. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to preserve history rather than let it disappear into legal limbo. "Do it," he said. They worked through the night. Vasquez coordinated while Marcus helped with the physical labor, moving containers to the temporary processing area on the flight deck, photographing each item, scanning documents, creating digital records that would survive whatever happened to the originals. By dawn, they had documented everything. The digital files were encrypted and transmitted to Vasquez's contacts through secure channels that Thomas had set up. The original materials were loaded onto federal transport vehicles, headed for a storage facility that even Raymond didn't know about. Marcus watched the trucks pull away as the sun rose over the Elizabeth River. He was exhausted, his bad leg throbbing, his hands cramped from hours of careful work. But he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose, direction, the sense that everything he'd endured was leading somewhere meaningful. Colonel Hayes called that afternoon. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What kind of problem? "Kozlov knows. About the documents, about everything. One of the marshals was compromised. He's been feeding information to Atlantic Maritime for weeks." The world tilted. Marcus gripped the edge of his table for support. "The documents are gone. We moved them last night." "Good. That's the only reason I'm calling instead of organizing your extraction." She paused. "The corrupted marshal is in custody. We're interrogating him now, but Kozlov is already moving. He's filed an emergency injunction claiming that you've been stealing assets from the salvage site. He's trying to get the courts to freeze everything." "Can he do that?" "Not if we move fast. Raymond is already in front of a judge presenting evidence of Kozlov's criminal connections. If we can get an emergency ruling in our favor, we can lock him out of the legal process entirely." Marcus's mind raced. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet. Stay where you are. Keep your head down. And Marcus, be ready to move if I call. This could go sideways fast." The next 48 hours were the longest of Marcus's life. He stayed in his trailer with Sargent. The security guards doubled, his pistol never more than arm's reach away. He watched news reports about the legal battle unfolding in federal court, saw Raymond's face on television defending his client's rights, heard pundits speculating about the treasure's fate. Kozlov's lawyers were aggressive, flooding the court with motions and counterclaims. They painted Marcus as an opportunist, a mentally unstable veteran exploiting a legal loophole to steal property that rightfully belonged to others. They produced witnesses who claimed to have surveyed the carrier before Marcus ever found it. They questioned his military record, his discharge status, his mental health. Raymond dismantled each argument with surgical precision. He presented Marcus's photographs, dated and authenticated. He introduced Captain Petrov's journal and letter. He called witnesses from the federal inspection team who testified to Marcus's cooperation and integrity, and then he played his trump card. "Your Honor," Raymond said, his voice carrying through the courtroom, "I would like to introduce evidence demonstrating that the plaintiff, Atlantic Maritime Solutions, is controlled by individuals with documented ties to international organized crime. Specifically, I present financial records tracing payments from a consortium connected to Viktor Kozlov, a figure currently under investigation by Interpol for smuggling, money laundering, and murder." The courtroom erupted. Kozlov's lawyers demanded a recess. The judge banged his gavel for order. News cameras captured every moment of chaos. By the time order was restored, the damage was done. The judge ordered a temporary restraining order against Atlantic Maritime Solutions, freezing their claims pending a full investigation of their finances and ownership structure. Marcus's salvage claim remained intact. Colonel Hayes called that evening, her voice warm with relief. "It's not over," she cautioned. "Kozlov won't give up easily, but we bought time, and time is what we needed." "What happens now?" "Now we build your foundation. Get the paperwork in place. Start setting up programs before anyone else can challenge your ownership." She paused. "And Marcus, we need to talk about security, long-term security. Kozlov has a long memory and deep pockets. This isn't going to be over just because we won in court." Marcus looked around his trailer, at the faded photographs on the wall, at Sargent sleeping peacefully on the narrow bed. He thought about the life he'd been living, the isolation, the fear, the constant vigilance. "What do you suggest?" "I suggest we make you too visible to touch. Media interviews, public appearances. The more famous you become, the harder it is for someone to make you disappear quietly." She paused. "It's not the life you planned, but it might be the life that keeps you alive." Marcus considered her words. He'd spent his entire adult life avoiding attention, doing his job quietly, trusting that competence would speak for itself. The idea of becoming a public figure was deeply uncomfortable, but he thought about the veterans he wanted to help, the foundation he wanted to build, the legacy he wanted to create. None of that would happen if Kozlov's people put a bullet in his head some dark night. "Okay," he said finally. "Tell me what to do." The first interview aired 3 weeks later. A major network, prime time, millions of viewers. Marcus sat across from a journalist known for tough questions and tougher follow-ups. He wore his best clothes, which weren't very good, and tried not to let his hands shake. "You've been called a treasure hunter, a hero, and a thief," the journalist began. "Which one is accurate?" Marcus took a breath. "None of them, probably. I'm just a veteran who found something unexpected and decided to do the right thing with it." The right thing being a foundation for homeless veterans? That's part of it. The real goal is to make sure that people who served their country don't get forgotten when they come home. He paused. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like nobody cares whether you live or die. I don't want other veterans to feel that way." The interview continued for an hour. Marcus talked about his service, his injuries, his brother's betrayal. He talked about the carrier, the discovery, the legal battles. He talked about Captain Petrov's letter and the obligation he felt to honor a dead man's final wish. By the time it ended, something had shifted. Marcus was no longer just a claimant in a legal dispute. He was a symbol, a story, a cause that people could believe in. Donations started pouring in before the credits finished rolling. The Autumn Harvest Foundation, named after the Soviet operation that had hidden the treasure, was officially incorporated 2 months later. Marcus served as its chairman, though he insisted on a professional director to handle day-to-day operations. Colonel Hayes joined the board, as did Captain Vasquez and several other veterans who had heard his story and wanted to help. The first project was a veterans' village in Norfolk, built on land adjacent to the shipyard where Marcus had worked as a security guard. Small homes, community spaces, counseling centers, job training facilities. Everything a returning soldier might need to rebuild their life. Marcus oversaw the construction personally, walking the site daily, talking to contractors, making decisions about details that most chairmen would have delegated. He wanted to know every nail, every board, every square foot of what they were building. Sargent came with him everywhere, the former stray now sleek and healthy, his brown eyes still carrying that intelligence that had first drawn Marcus to him. The workers loved the dog. He became an unofficial mascot, his presence a reminder that the foundation was about second chances for everyone who needed them. The legal process continued in the background. Raymond navigated claims and counterclaims with endless patience. The Russian Federation eventually withdrew their demand for full repatriation, settling instead for the return of certain state documents and a permanent loan of selected artwork to Russian museums. Previous owners of looted art were identified where possible, their descendants contacted, restitution offered where appropriate. Kozlov's criminal enterprise collapsed under the weight of the evidence Diana had uncovered. Federal prosecutors indicted him on 17 counts of money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy. His assets were frozen, his lieutenants arrested, his network dismantled piece by piece. He never stood trial. 6 months after the indictments were announced, Kozlov was found dead in his Geneva apartment. The official ruling was suicide. Nobody believed it. Marcus didn't celebrate the news. He'd learned that revenge was hollow, that destroying enemies didn't fill the voids they'd created. He just kept building, kept working, kept trying to turn tragedy into hope. The first residents of the veterans' village moved in on a cold December morning, exactly 2 years after Marcus had first climbed aboard the carrier. There were 12 of them initially, men and women who had served in different branches, different wars, different decades. What they shared was need, and what they found was community. Marcus stood at the entrance, shaking hands as they arrived. Some he knew from V meetings. Some were strangers who had heard about the foundation and applied. All of them looked at the small homes, the warm lights, the promise of stability, with expressions that Marcus recognized all too well. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, desperate hope. "Welcome home," he told each of them, and he meant it. The veterans' village grew faster than anyone had anticipated. What started as 12 residents in that first cold December became 30 by spring, then 60 by summer. The waiting list stretched into the hundreds, names from every state, every branch, every era of conflict. Marcus read every application personally, staying up late into the night learning the stories of men and women who had given everything and received nothing in return. The Foundation's headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse near the village, its walls lined with photographs of residents past and present, its conference rooms filled with the constant hum of activity. Social workers, job counselors, mental health professionals, and volunteers moved through the space with purpose, each one committed to the mission Marcus had articulated in interview after interview. No veteran left behind. The money from the treasure continued to flow through the legal system, released in stages as claims were settled and disputes resolved. Raymond Shue had been right about the timeline. 3 years after Marcus first filed his salvage claim, the process was still ongoing. But enough had been distributed to fund operations for decades, with more coming every quarter. Marcus lived simply despite the wealth now attached to his name. He'd moved out of the trailer eventually, Colonel Hayes insisting that a chairman couldn't conduct business from a rusted airstream. But the house he chose was modest, a small craftsman bungalow not unlike his mother's, located within walking distance of the village. Sergeant had a proper yard now, space to run and chase squirrels, though the old dog was slowing down, his muzzle graying, his steps more careful than they'd once been. The nightmares still came, though less frequently. Marcus had learned to manage them, working with a therapist who specialized in combat trauma, developing techniques that didn't eliminate the memories but made them bearable. Some nights he still woke gasping, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. But now there was purpose waiting in the morning, work that mattered, a reason to keep fighting. The media attention had faded somewhat, as it always does. Marcus was no longer the daily headline he'd been during the legal battles, but the Foundation's work continued to generate interest, journalists arriving periodically to document the village's growth, to interview residents whose lives had been transformed, to capture the quiet revolution happening on the shores of the Elizabeth River. It was during one of these media visits that Marcus received the call he'd been dreading. His phone buzzed during a tour of the new vocational training center. He excused himself, stepping into a quiet hallway to check the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made his stomach tighten. "Hello?" "Marcus." The voice was older than he remembered, rougher around the edges, but unmistakable. "It's David." Marcus said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with everything that had happened and everything that could never be undone. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," David continued. His voice carried something Marcus hadn't expected, uncertainty, fear even. "But I need to talk to you, in person, please." "Why?" "Because I owe you that much. Because I've watched what you've been doing on the news and David's voice cracked. "I need to explain. Even if you never forgive me, I need you to understand." Marcus closed his eyes. He thought about all the nights he'd spent in that trailer, alone with his anger, imagining this conversation. He'd rehearsed it 1,000 times, the accusations he would make, the pain he would inflict, the justice he would demand. But standing here now, with the sounds of veterans learning new skills echoing through the walls, the anger felt different. Smaller, less important than it once had been. "Where?" he asked finally. "Anywhere you want, I'll come to you." "There's a diner on Hampton Boulevard, near the shipyard, tomorrow at noon. I'll be there." Marcus ended the call without saying goodbye. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, his heart pounding, his mind racing through memories he'd tried to bury. Then he took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and returned to the tour. The night before the meeting, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat on his back porch, Sargent curled at his feet, watching stars appear through gaps in the clouds. The old dog's breathing was labored now, a reminder that time moved forward whether we wanted it to or not. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked softly. "Should I hear him out?" Sargent lifted his head, brown eyes reflecting the porch light, and gave a soft woof that could have meant anything. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I don't know either." He thought about what he wanted from this conversation. Not money, the Foundation had more than enough. Not apologies, though he suspected those would come. What he wanted, he realized, was something simpler and more complicated at the same time. He wanted to understand, how does someone betray their own blood? How does a brother steal from a brother? What happens inside a person to make them choose greed over loyalty, self-interest over family? Marcus had asked himself these questions for years without finding answers. Maybe David could provide them. Or maybe there were no answers. Maybe some betrayals were simply inexplicable, born from weaknesses that no explanation could justify. Either way, Marcus needed to close this chapter, not for David's sake, but for his own. The diner was mostly empty when Marcus arrived. A few truck drivers nursing coffee at the counter, a young couple sharing a plate of fries in the corner booth, the quiet clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Marcus chose a table near the window where he could watch the door and ordered black coffee that he didn't intend to drink. David walked in at exactly noon. He looked older than Marcus remembered, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleepless nights of his own. He was dressed simply, no expensive watch or designer jacket, just jeans and a button-down shirt that had seen better days. He spotted Marcus and hesitated, something flickering across his face. Then he walked over and slid into the opposite booth, his movements careful, almost humble. "Thank you for coming," David said. Marcus said nothing, he just waited. David took a breath, his hands fidgeting on the table. "I don't know where to start. I've thought about this conversation so many times, what I would say, how I would explain. But now that I'm here..." He shook his head. "There's no good explanation. There's just the truth." "Then tell me the truth." David looked at his hands. "When you deployed that last time, things weren't good. The insurance company had been cutting commissions. Karen and I were behind on the mortgage. The kids needed things we couldn't afford. I was scared, Marcus. Scared in a way I'd never been before. So you stole from me." I told myself it wasn't stealing. I told myself you'd understand. You were overseas, making good money, no expenses. The house was just sitting there. The power of attorney meant I could access your accounts. I thought, David's voice broke, I thought I could borrow it. Pay it back before you came home. You'd never know the difference. But you didn't pay it back. No. David looked up, his eyes wet. The more I took, the easier it got. The house sold, and suddenly there was real money. Money that could solve all our problems. I told myself you'd be okay. You'd understand. You'd forgive me because that's what family does. Family doesn't steal from family. I know. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I know that now. I knew it then too, somewhere deep down. But I convinced myself otherwise. And by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late to undo it. Marcus felt the anger rising, familiar and hot. But there was something else beneath it now, something that felt almost like pity. "Do you know what happened to me when I came home?" Marcus asked quietly. "Do you know what it was like to find strangers living in my mother's house, to discover that my own brother had taken everything while I was bleeding in a hospital bed?" David's face crumpled. "I know. I've read the interviews. I've seen the stories. God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back those years. Sorry doesn't erase the nights I spent in a rusted trailer, wondering if anyone in the world cared whether I lived or died." "I know it doesn't." David's voice was barely a whisper. "I know nothing I say can make this right. I needed you to know that I hate myself for what I did. Every day. Every single day." Marcus looked at his brother, really looked at him for the first time since sitting down. David was broken. Not financially, though that was probably true too, but spiritually, emotionally, fundamentally broken in ways that went beyond money or houses or inheritance. "Where's Karen?" Marcus asked. David laughed bitterly. "Gone. Left me 2 years ago. Took the kids, moved to her sister's place in Ohio. Said she couldn't stand living with someone who did what I did." He paused. "The insurance company fired me. Said they couldn't have someone with my ethics representing their brand. I've been working odd jobs, trying to stay afloat." Marcus absorbed this information. There was a time when he would have felt satisfaction hearing about David's downfall, a sense of cosmic justice being served. But sitting here now, looking at the shell of the brother he'd once admired, he felt only sadness. "I'm not going to forgive you," Marcus said finally. "I want you to understand that. What you did, it can't be forgiven. Not really. Some betrayals are too deep." David nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know, I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm not going to hate you anymore either." Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady. "I spent years carrying that hate around, letting it poison everything. It almost destroyed me. And then I found something that taught me there's more to life than revenge and resentment." "The treasure," David whispered. "Not just the treasure, the purpose that came with it, the veterans I've been able to help, the lives I've been able to change." Marcus paused. "I'm not going to let what you did define me anymore. I'm going to keep building, keep helping, keep moving forward." David was sobbing now, silent tears shaking his shoulders. "I don't deserve a brother like you." "No," Marcus agreed. "You don't." They sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the diner filling the space between them. Finally, Marcus stood. "I don't want to see you again," he said. "I don't want to hear from you. Whatever relationship we had, it's over. But I hope—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I hope you find a way to live with what you did. I hope you find some kind of peace, not for my sake, but for yours." David looked up at him, his face ravaged by grief. "Marcus." "Goodbye, David." Marcus walked out of the diner without looking back. The autumn sun was warm on his face, the air crisp with the promise of cooler days to come. He felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. He drove to the Veterans Village and spent the afternoon walking the grounds, talking to residents, checking on construction of the new community center. By evening, the encounter with David felt like something that had happened to someone else, a chapter from a book he'd finished reading. Colonel Hayes called as he was having dinner. "Heard you met with your brother today." Marcus smiled faintly. "News travels fast. I have my sources. How did it go?" "It went." He paused. "I said what I needed to say. I heard what he needed to tell me. And now it's over." "Are you okay?" Marcus thought about the question. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I am." The aircraft carrier conversion project began the following spring. Marcus had been thinking about it for months, turning the idea over in his mind like a stone he couldn't stop touching. The carrier had been the catalyst for everything that followed. It seemed fitting that it should become something permanent, something meaningful, rather than being scrapped or forgotten once the legal process concluded. The concept was ambitious. Transform the vessel into a floating museum and memorial, honoring both the American veterans the Foundation served and the forgotten Soviet sailors whose hidden treasure had made it all possible. The carrier would tell a story of Cold War secrecy, of empires rising and falling, of treasures lost and found. But more importantly, it would tell a story of redemption, of second chances, of purposes discovered in unexpected places. Captain Vasquez led the technical planning, her expertise in maritime preservation proving invaluable. The carrier's structure was sound despite decades of neglect. With proper reinforcement and restoration, it could serve as a stable platform for decades to come. The project attracted international attention. Historians, architects, and naval experts offered their services. Veterans from across the country volunteered their labor. Funding poured in from donors who wanted to be part of something historic. The Russian government, in an unexpected gesture of cooperation, provided materials from their own archives, photographs of the carrier in its prime, records of its service history, testimonies from surviving crew members who remembered serving aboard. Captain Petrov's journal was returned, carefully preserved, to be displayed in a place of honor. Marcus visited the carrier regularly during the conversion process, walking corridors that had once been dark and dangerous, now bright with construction lights and echoing with the sounds of work. He would stand in Section 7, the treasure hold that had changed his life, and try to imagine the sailors who had sealed it 3 decades ago, believing they were protecting something important for a future they would never see. In a way, they had been right. The museum opened on a clear June morning, exactly 5 years after Marcus first climbed that rusted ladder. The ceremony was attended by dignitaries, veterans, journalists, and thousands of visitors who had traveled from around the world to witness the event. Marcus stood on the flight deck looking out at the crowd. Colonel Hayes was beside him, along with Captain Vasquez, Raymond Shue, and the core team that had been with him from the beginning. Sargent was there too, older and grayer but still loyal, his presence a reminder of simpler times when it had been just the two of them against the world. "Are you ready?" Colonel Hayes asked softly. Marcus nodded. "Let's do this." He stepped to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the faces before him. Veterans in wheelchairs and on crutches, families with children on their shoulders, reporters with cameras and notepads, officials with carefully neutral expressions, and scattered throughout, the residents of the veterans' village, the men and women whose lives had been rebuilt by what he'd found in the darkness below. 5 years ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying across the flight deck, I was a broken man. I'd lost my home, my savings, my family, my faith in almost everything. I was living in a rusted trailer at the edge of a shipyard, working security for minimum wage, wondering if there was any point in going on. He paused, letting the words settle. Then one night, I saw something in the darkness, something that didn't belong, something that called to me in a way I couldn't explain. I followed that call, and it led me here to this ship, to a treasure that had been hidden for over 30 years. Marcus looked around at the restored vessel, at the gleaming rails and fresh paint, at the displays and exhibits that told its story. But the real treasure wasn't gold or platinum or diamonds. The real treasure was purpose, the discovery of something worth living for, the realization that even when everything seems lost, there might be something waiting in the darkness that can change everything. He thought of Captain Petrov, of the letter he'd written in the final days of an empire. Use it for good. This museum is a memorial to that possibility. It honors the Soviet sailors who protected these assets during chaos and collapse. It honors the American veterans who have given so much for their country. And it honors everyone who has ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or abandoned, by reminding us that second chances exist if we have the courage to seek them. Marcus stepped back from the podium. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound rolling across the water like thunder. He stood there, accepting it, not for himself, but for everyone who had helped build what they were celebrating. That evening, after the dignitaries had departed and the crowds had thinned, Marcus walked the museum alone. The exhibits were beautifully designed, telling the carrier's story from construction to abandonment to resurrection. He paused at the display of Captain Petrov's journal, reading the familiar words one more time. "May whoever finds this have more courage than we did. Use it for good." Marcus smiled softly. "I'm trying, Captain," he whispered. "I'm trying." He continued through the ship, past displays of recovered artwork, past cases containing gold bars that gleamed under museum lighting, past photographs of veterans whose lives had been changed by the Foundation. In Section 7, now transformed into the heart of the museum, a permanent exhibit explained the discovery, using Marcus's original photographs and audio recordings to recreate the moment when a broken veteran found something extraordinary in the darkness. He stood there for a long time, lost in memory. The sound of footsteps interrupted his reverie. He turned to see a young woman approaching, perhaps 25, wearing the uniform of the museum staff. Her name tag read Eleanor. "Mr. Cole," she said hesitantly, "I'm sorry to disturb you. I just wanted to thank you." Marcus tilted his head. "For what?" "For building this place. For starting the Foundation." She took a breath. "My father was a veteran, 2 tours in Iraq. When he came home, he wasn't the same. He struggled with PTSD, couldn't hold a job, couldn't connect with anyone. For years, we thought we'd lost him." Her voice trembled slightly. Then he heard about the Autumn Harvest Foundation. He applied for residency at the village and got accepted. That was 3 years ago. Today, he's working as a counselor, helping other veterans through what he went through. He's happy again. He's my dad again. Marcus felt his throat tighten. "I'm glad we could help." Eleanor shook her head. "You don't understand. You saved his life. You saved our whole family. And now I get to work here, in this incredible place, helping tell a story that means something." She wiped her eyes. "So thank you. From the bottom of my heart." She turned and walked away before Marcus could respond. He watched her go, his own eyes burning with emotion. This was why he'd done it. Not for recognition or wealth or revenge against those who had wronged him, but for moments like this, for the lives touched, the families restored, the hope kindled in darkness. The museum thrived in the months that followed. Visitors came from every continent, drawn by the extraordinary story and the chance to walk the decks of a vessel unlike any other. Educational programs brought thousands of students through each year. Veterans groups held ceremonies on the flight deck. Researchers accessed the preserved documents, uncovering new insights into Cold War history. The Foundation continued to expand as well. New veterans' villages opened in Texas, California, and Florida. The vocational training program graduated its 500th participant. The Mental Health Initiative published research that changed how the VA approached combat trauma. What had started as one man's desperate salvage claim had become a movement that touched lives across the nation. Marcus remained at the center of it all, though he tried to stay out of the spotlight when possible. He preferred the quiet work, visiting villages, meeting residents, reviewing applications, ensuring that the Foundation never lost sight of its mission. He served on the board and made decisions when necessary, but he trusted his team to handle the daily operations. Sargent passed away on a quiet autumn evening, 7 years after Marcus had first found him wandering the shipyard. The old dog had been declining for months, his movements slow, his breathing labored. Marcus was with him at the end, stroking his grey fur, whispering thanks for years of companionship. They buried him near the veterans' village, in a small garden that residents had created for remembrance. Someone carved a simple marker, Sargent, faithful friend, beloved companion. Veterans stopped by to pay respects, leaving treats and toys, honoring the dog who had been part of their community's founding. Marcus mourned deeply but didn't break. He'd learned that grief was part of life, not an obstacle to it. Sargent had given him everything a dog could give. Now it was time to let go and remember with gratitude rather than sorrow. A year later, on the anniversary of Sargent's death, Marcus visited the garden and found a surprise waiting. A young German Shepherd mix, maybe 6 months old, sitting beside Sargent's marker with a red ribbon around his neck and a note attached. "For Mr. Cole," the note read. "Every guardian needs a companion. Thank you for everything." It was unsigned, but Marcus recognized the handwriting. Eleanor, the museum staff member whose father had found new life at the village. He knelt down, and the puppy bounded into his arms, all energy and enthusiasm and unearned love. Marcus laughed, really laughed, the sound startling in its unfamiliarity. "All right," he said, scratching behind the puppy's ears. "What should I call you?" The puppy barked once, sharp and eager. "Cadet," Marcus decided. "How's that sound?" Cadet barked again, apparently satisfied. They walked home together, Marcus's bad leg still aching after all these years, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The world kept turning. Loss gave way to new beginnings, and somewhere in the darkness, treasures still waited for those brave enough to seek them. Marcus Cole stood on the flight deck of the Carrier Museum, watching the sun set over the Elizabeth River. Cadet sat beside him, now fully grown, a patient and devoted companion who had inherited Sargent's quiet wisdom along with his protective instincts. It had been 10 years since that first climb up the rusted ladder. 10 years since he'd found Captain Petrov's journal in a dusty cabin. 10 years since a broken veteran discovered something that changed everything. The Foundation had helped over 12,000 veterans in that decade. The museum had welcomed millions of visitors. The story had been told in books, documentaries, and countless articles. Marcus had received honors and awards he never sought, recognition that still made him uncomfortable despite its sincerity. But what mattered most wasn't the numbers or the accolades. What mattered was the lives touched, the families restored, the purposes discovered. What mattered was the young veteran he'd met last week, just discharged, struggling with the same demons Marcus had faced, finding hope in a village designed for exactly this moment. Colonel Hayes had retired from government service, but remained on the Foundation's board. Captain Vasquez continued to lead the museum's maritime preservation efforts. Raymond Sue had become one of the most respected salvage lawyers in the country, his reputation built on the case that had seemed impossible. The team that had formed in that Arlington conference room had become a family, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. Marcus thought about his brother sometimes, not often, and not with the bitterness that had once consumed him. David had become a cautionary tale in his mind, a reminder of what happened when fear and greed overrode loyalty and love. He'd heard through distant channels that David was still alive, still struggling, still carrying the weight of what he'd done. Marcus felt neither satisfaction nor concern at the news. That chapter was closed. There was nothing more to say. He thought about his mother more often, about her rose garden, her quiet faith, her belief that good things came to those who persevered. She would have loved what her son had built. She would have understood better than anyone that the treasure wasn't the point. The point was what you did with it. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The museum's lights flickered on, illuminating the restored vessel like a beacon in the gathering darkness. Marcus reached down and scratched Cadet behind the ears. "What do you think, boy? Ready to head home?" Cadet's tail wagged, his eyes bright with simple joy. They walked together through the museum, past displays that told stories of sacrifice and redemption, past photographs of veterans whose lives had been rebuilt, past the sealed hold where a fortune had waited for 30 years to be discovered by someone who would use it for good. At the entrance, a new plaque had been installed. Marcus paused to read it, though he already knew the words by heart. Dedicated to Captain Anatoly Petrov and the sailors of the Soviet Navy who protected these treasures during chaos and collapse. And to the veterans of all nations who gave everything for their countries only to find themselves forgotten when they returned home. May this museum remind us that second chances exist for those brave enough to seek them, and that purpose can be found in the most unexpected places. Marcus touched the plaque gently, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. "Thank you, Captain," he whispered, "for trusting a stranger with your legacy, for believing that someone would do the right thing." He stepped out into the cool evening air, Cadet trotting beside him. The walk home took 20 minutes, past the veterans' village where lights glowed in windows and laughter echoed from common areas, past the construction site where a new education center was rising, past the garden where Sergeant rested beneath a simple marker. His house was modest but warm, filled with books and photographs and the quiet comforts of a life well lived. Marcus made dinner for himself and Cadet, a simple meal that his mother would have recognized. He ate on the back porch, watching stars appear through gaps in the clouds, feeling the peace that had eluded him for so many years. He thought about the young man he'd been when he first enlisted, full of idealism and certainty about how life would unfold. He thought about the broken veteran who'd limped through that airport alone, betrayed and abandoned. He thought about the moment when he'd pulled back a canvas tarp and seen gold gleaming in the darkness. Every step of the journey had been necessary. Every loss, every betrayal, every night of despair. Without the pain, he wouldn't have been open to the discovery. Without the discovery, he wouldn't have found his purpose. Without the purpose, none of this, the foundation, the museum, the thousands of lives touched, would exist. The treasure hadn't just been wealth. It had been transformation. A chance to become someone new, someone better, someone who could take tragedy and turn it into triumph. Marcus finished his dinner and went inside. Cadet settled into his bed near the fireplace. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the distant hum of the river. Before turning off the lights, Marcus paused at the photograph that hung above his desk. It showed him standing on the carrier's flight deck, surrounded by the team that had helped him navigate the impossible journey from discovery to foundation. Colonel Hayes was there, and Captain Vasquez and Raymond Ixu. They were all smiling, caught in a moment of pure joy. Beside the photograph was a framed letter, the original he'd found in Captain Petrov's desk all those years ago. The paper was yellow now, the ink faded, but the words remained clear. "Use it for good." Marcus touched the frame gently. "I tried, Captain," he said softly. "I tried." He turned off the lights and went to bed. Sleep came easily these days, the nightmares that had once tormented him now rare and manageable. He dreamed of open water, of ships sailing toward horizons, of treasures discovered and purposes fulfilled. When he woke in the morning, the sun was streaming through his windows and Cadet was waiting eagerly by the door. Another day waited, full of work to be done and lives to be touched and a legacy to be built. Marcus Cole, once broken, now whole, stepped out to meet it. Anyone can rise from betrayal if they refuse to let bitterness define them. Anyone can turn discovery into legacy if they remember that wealth means nothing without purpose. And anyone can find treasure in the darkness if they're brave enough to look. Sometimes the deepest riches aren't gold or diamonds or platinum. They're the choices we make when no one is watching, the hands we extend to those who have fallen, the second chances we offer to ourselves and others. Marcus Cole found a fortune worth $260 million in the hold of a forgotten aircraft carrier. But what he built with it was worth infinitely more. Because for Marcus, and for every veteran his foundation has helped, the real treasure was never about money. It was about purpose. It was about redemption. It was about proving that no one is ever truly forgotten, as long as someone is brave enough to remember. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories of resilience and redemption are waiting for you. Click to keep exploring with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that forgotten heroes still deserve their moment to shine.